Next speaker is going to be the Professor Jae Gyu Kim from Korea. Currently, Professor Kim is the Director Scientific Board of the Korean Society of Gastroenterology. Professor Kim going to talk about how to follow with the Gastric Premalignant Lesions. Professor Kim, please.
I have no COI to disclose. The contents of presentation are as follows. Today, I would like to focus on the surveillance of intestinal metaplasia and dysplasia, and I present gastric cancer screening experience of Korea. At the end, I introduce a recently conducted systematic review of surveillance interval of intestinal metaplasia in Korea. Gastric cancer is still a major problem, ranking 5th for incidence and 3rd for cancer-related mortality worldwide. Most gastric cancers are diagnosed at the late stage, and most patients diagnosed with gastric cancer die of the disease. Chronic infection with Helicobacter pylori is the primary risk factor for gastric cancer, and at least 80% of the global gastric cancer burden attributable to this pathogen. Intestinal type gastric cancer has been shown a follow pattern of stepwise progression known as the Korea cascade. This sequence describes a progression from chronic gastritis to atrophic gastritis, intestinal metaplasia, dysplasia, and eventually to adenocarcinoma. There are several factors revealed or suggested as risk factors for gastric cancer. Patients with atrophic gastritis or gastric intestinal metaplasia are also known to bear increased risk of gastric cancer. The ability to identify precursor lesions on gastric biopsies raised interest in developing screening and surveillance strategies for early detection and prevention of gastric cancer. Premalignant condition of gastric cancer is an umbrella term for high-risk stage developing gastric cancer. Intestinal metaplasia is considered as a preneoplastic lesion that has crossed a point of no return, and dysplasia is a well-known precursor lesion for gastric cancer. Today, I will be focusing on intestinal metaplasia and dysplasia as a premalignant region for surveillance. There was a Swedish study showing the cumulative incidence of gastric cancer among patients with various precancerous regions. This was a population-based cohort study with average follow-up duration of 10 years, including over 400,000 patients who had gastric biopsy. In this study, the risk of gastric cancer increased in patients with premalignant conditions. The hazard ratio of gastric cancer was 6.2, 10.9 in intestinal metaplasia and dysplasia respectively. The risk of gastric cancer development within 20 years, 1 in 39 with intestinal metaplasia, 1 in 19 with dysplasia respectively. Intestinal metaplasia harbors an increased risk of gastric cancer development. Definition of gastric intestinal metaplasia is replacement of the surface, foveola, and glandular epithelium in oxyntic or enteral mucosa by intestinal epithelium. Intestinal metaplasia can be classified by topographic extent, histologic subtypes. Gastric intestinal metaplasia staging system is used to evaluate the severity and extent of intestinal metaplasia. Intestinal metaplasia can be classified as complete or incomplete type histologically. Complete intestinal metaplasia displays goblet and absorptive cells, decreased expression of gastric mucins, and expression of intestinal mucin. Incomplete intestinal metaplasias display goblet and columnar non-absorptive cells with co-expression of gastric mucins together with the intestinal mucins encompassing type 2 and 3. Intestinal metaplasia may be considered extensive when it involves at least 2 locations or when it is moderate or marked in more than one biopsy site. Intestinal metaplasia is categorized anatomically as limited if it is confined to antrum or incisura. Intestinal metaplasia is highly prevalent in general population undergoing upper endoscopy. Helicobacter pylori infections significantly raise intestinal metaplasia prevalence, and its prevalence rate increases with age. Intestinal metaplasia prevalence is higher in first-degree relatives of gastric cancer patients. Prevalence of intestinal metaplasia is variable by region from 3.4 to 23.9%. East Asia, South America, East-South Europe show relatively high prevalence. While the prevalence was 21% in East Asia, the prevalence was only 6.5% in Southeast Asia. The annual rate of progression from intestinal metaplasia to gastric cancer was 0.124%. In Korea, the annual rate was 0.187%. Another meta-analysis compared patients with or without intestinal metaplasia. Intestinal metaplasia patients were at higher risk of gastric cancer with an odds ratio of 3.58. In a recent meta-analysis, including 87,000 individuals with intestinal metaplasia, the gastric cancer incidence rate was 3.38. Among them, gastric cancer incidence rate in Asia was higher with 7.58. When we plan a surveillance in patients with intestinal metaplasia, we should think about these factors. Is the surveillance reasonable? Who should be targeted for surveillance? How to perform the surveillance? What should the surveillance interval and cost effectiveness? No randomized controlled studies on the benefit of intestinal metaplasia surveillance have been carried out. There are only data from some observational studies. In a UK study with more than 12 years follow-up, the portion of EGC was higher in patients with intestinal metaplasia type 3 under surveillance. In another UK study of 10 years follow-up, gastric cancer was detected earlier in the surveillance group, and this group showed higher survival. In a European study, dysplasia or cancer was only developed in extended atrophy intestinal metaplasia group. If high-risk group of gastric cancer can be selected appropriately, application of surveillance to the population can be reasonable. We can assume the potential benefit of surveillance endoscope from the experience of nationwide screening endoscopy from Korea and Japan. In Japan and Korea, more than 50% of all gastric cancers are detected at early stage, while only 15% are EGC in Europe. To select the target population for surveillance, risk stratification is essential. Current guidelines do not recommend the surveillance in patients with gastric atrophy or gastric intestinal metaplasia limited just to the gastric antrum unless there are additional risk factors. Results from recent meta-analysis showed incomplete type intestinal metaplasia patients were at high risk of gastric cancer compared with those with complete type intestinal metaplasia. Relative risk of progression to gastric cancer according to incomplete versus complete intestinal metaplasia on baseline histology was 3.33. Extensive intestinal metaplasia also seemed to have higher risk of progression to gastric cancer compared to limited intestinal metaplasia with a relative risk of 2.07, although this was statistically non-significant. Recent meta-analysis showed corpus intestinal metaplasia has higher risk of progression to gastric cancer with odds ratio 7.39 compared to limited intestinal metaplasia with odds ratio 4.06. This slide shows the relative risk of progression to gastric cancer in intestinal metaplasia patients with versus without a family history of gastric cancer was 4.53. The operative link on gastritis assessment with intestinal metaplasia, or GIM, is an useful staging system. Atrophic gastritis and intestinal metaplasia were scored according to the visual analog scale of the updated Sydney classification. This system can be used for categorization of risk of gastric cancer progression. Several studies have demonstrated more extensive intestinal metaplasia correlate with increased risk of gastric cancer. Retrospective cohort study from Finland reported cumulative gastric cancer event rate was significantly higher in high origin states with a value of 10.8%. So the AJ guidelines suggest the high-risk group of intestinal metaplasia as incomplete type, extensive, or with family history of gastric cancer. The benefit of doing non-targeted biopsies in patients under surveillance has not been established. For patients with an indication for surveillance, we recommended a high-quality endoscopy with contrast-enhanced endoscopy and biopsies of only the irregular suspicious for dysplasia areas with no further biopsy being needed. Regarding the schedule for surveillance, the MAPS-1 guideline in 2012 recommended, based on expert opinion, surveillance every 3 years in patients at high risk for gastric cancer. And evidence are not so strong enough to change the recommended 3-year surveillance interval uniformly. But some recent evidences suggest high-risk subgroups may benefit from tighter endoscopic surveillance schedule. British guideline and ESGE guideline offered similar suggestions, recommending the surveillance every 3 years in those with high-risk features of intestinal metaplasia or other coexisting risk factors such as persistent HP infection, autoimmune gastritis. MAPS-2 guideline additionally suggests surveillance with shorter interval or those with advanced atrophy and family history of gastric cancer. According to AJ guideline in 2020, endoscopic surveillance can be considered in 3 to 5 years. In incomplete, extensive intestinal metaplasia and those with family history of gastric cancer, high-risk race or ethnicity. I would like to move on to gastric dysplasia, which is well known as a precursor region for gastric cancer. This figure shows summary of the natural course of dysplasia. High-grade dysplasia shows especially high progression rate to invasive cancer over time. In British guideline, when there is a visible dysplastic region, endoscopic resection need to be performed. Subsequent annual systematic endoscopy is warranted after resection. When there is invisible low-grade dysplasia, the guideline recommends a second endoscopy with enhanced imaging and extensive biopsy sampling, followed by repeated endoscopy within 1 year. If there is persistent, non-visible low-grade dysplasia, endoscopy should be repeated annually. This can be stopped when there is no dysplasia on 3 consecutive endoscopies. For invisible high-grade dysplasia, immediate endoscopy is needed. Ongoing surveillance is recommended at 6 monthly intervals for persistent non-visible high-grade dysplasia. This is a result from our hospital. We analyzed the risk of metachronous gastric neoplasm after ESD of 244 patients with gastric dysplasia. During a median follow-up of 2.5 years, metachronous gastric neoplasms developed in 10.6% of low-grade dysplasia group and 13% of high-grade dysplasia group. Hazard ratio for metachronous gastric neoplasms were not different from those of low-grade dysplasia group. However, considering patients without Helicobacter pylori infection, those in high-grade dysplasia group had a significantly increased risk of metachronous high-grade dysplasia or gastric cancer compared to those in low-grade dysplasia group. Therefore, surveillance endoscopy is needed to detect metachronous gastric neoplasms after endoscopic resection of gastric dysplasia, especially in patients high-grade dysplasia, including those without Helicobacter pylori infection. In terms of cost effectiveness, surveillance with the precancerous gastric condition is cost-effective in intermediate to high-risk regions, but conflicting results were published in intermediate or low-incidence countries. This indicates the rate of progression of precancerous lesion varies greatly from study to study. There is also a gap in the pathologic diagnosis between East and West, and it seems that the cost of examination varies by country. This figure from ESGE guideline shows the summary of surveillance strategy for gastric premalignant lesion. Atrophy or intestinal metaplasia is evaluated by the extent, and the surveillance is applied considering additional risk factors. Dysplasia should be resected when visible, while non-visible lesions need to be followed. Now, I am going to briefly introduce the National Cancer Screening Program and its effect in Korea. In Korea, population-based screening for gastric cancer was implemented in 2002 as part of the National Cancer Screening Program based on experts' opinion. It's biennial screening program for aged 40 years or older. Participants can choose EGD or upper GI series. Participant rate of National Cancer Screening Program for gastric cancer in Korea is steadily increasing, up to 62% in 2019. Let me show you the impact of gastric cancer screening in Korea. The 5-year survival rate of gastric cancer has greatly increased to over 70% since the introduction of National Cancer Screening Program in Korea. Compared to this, the survival rate in USA during early 2010s was 31%. During last 30 years, gastric cancer mortality decreased dramatically from 65.8% to 12.7% for male and 30.8% to 5% in female, showing almost 75% of reduction. Most countries show a gastric cancer mortality to incidence ratio of more than 0.7, when Korea has the lowest ratio for gastric cancer, 0.31. According to these indirect evidences, secondary prevention strategy by screening looks quite effective for mortality reduction in Korea. The main outcome is mortality reduction. There was a study showing the effectiveness of National Cancer Screening Program in reducing gastric cancer mortality. Compared with subjects who had never been screened, every screened subject showed a reduction of gastric cancer-related mortality by 21%. Especially, the endoscopy screening was more effective than upper GI series. There was 49% reduction in gastric cancer-related mortality among those between 40 to 74 in endoscopy group. To find out if there are any evidences in decreasing the surveillance interval to less than 2 years in intestinal metaplasia, we performed a systematic review in Korea. The key question was, is the surveillance endoscopy at intervals of less than 2 years helpful in reducing gastric cancer mortality in patients with intestinal metaplasia? During the literature search, there was no randomized controlled studies or prospective studies. So there are insufficient direct evidences supporting short surveillance interval for intestinal metaplasia. We tried to gather indirect evidences as follows: prevalence of intestinal metaplasia, longitudinal risk for incident gastric cancer in subjects with intestinal metaplasia, and potential risk and benefits of surveillance endoscope. There were several studies for prevalence of intestinal metaplasia in Korea. In one study, including 713 subjects with endoscopic biopsies, the age standardized prevalence of intestinal metaplasia was 26.2% in male and 24.2% in female. The prevalence of intestinal metaplasia is 10 to 34% in Korea. Next, the annual rate of progression from intestinal metaplasia to gastric cancer was 0.187% in Korea. The risk of gastric cancer is 18.7 per 10,000 persons in Korea. One Korean study reported Olga 3 and 4 and Olgim 1 to 4 were independent risk factors for gastric cancer, especially the intestinal type. The adjusted odds ratio increased as the Olgim stage was higher. So more intensive surveillance may be considered in high-risk individuals such as incomplete type, extensive intestinal metaplasia, and family history. But there is insufficient domestic evidence to support this strategy. Retrospective study including 561 patients showed in patients with intestinal metaplasia, the cutoff screening interval for detection of early gastric cancer and disease-free survival was 2 years. But intervals shorter than 2 years did not affect the survival rate of gastric cancer. The overall 5-year survival rate for repeated screening group was higher than for the infrequent screening group. But the survival of annual screening group was not different from biennial screening group. This study shows early detection of cancer and endoscopic resection was more frequent in the annual screening group. However, there was no difference in overall survival. This study reports potential harm of endoscopic surveillance. The incidence rate of serious complications such as bleeding perforation after upper endoscopy was very low, less than 1%. The possibility of early detection of gastric cancer increased by frequent endoscopic surveillance in subjects with intestinal metaplasia. But endoscopy at intervals of less than 2 years does not affect the gastric cancer mortality. Nevertheless, it is clear the risk of gastric cancer increases when intestinal metaplasia is present, and the risk associated with endoscopy is minimal. Finally, we conclude there was insufficient evidence to decide whether to recommend for or against endoscopic surveillance at intervals of less than 2 years in patients with intestinal metaplasia in Korea. Whether high-risk patients would benefit from annual endoscopy remains unanswered. Nevertheless, some indirect evidences suggest less than 2-year interval surveillance could be useful for some high-risk subjects with intestinal metaplasia. In summary, routine surveillance is not recommended for patients with intestinal metaplasia uniformly, in the absence of high-risk features. Current guidelines recommended a surveillance interval of 3 years in extensive gastric atrophy or intestinal metaplasia, limited gastric atrophy or intestinal metaplasia with additional risk factors, mainly based on Western data. Gastric dysplasia should be removed when visible, and the surveillance is needed if the region is invisible. Direct evidence is lacking for determining optimal strategy for endoscopic surveillance of intestinal metaplasia. Regional studies are needed. Surveillance of gastric premalignant conditions should be determined considering the regional prevalence, cost effectiveness, and the gastric cancer incidence and risk. I would like to thank Professor Eunjung Gong, Il-Ju Choi, and Soo-Jung Jo for helping me preparing this presentation. Thank you for your attention.